You're at a coffee shop. You reach for your cup, left hand. The person next to you reaches for theirs, right hand. Seems random, right? Like, who cares? But here's the thing. This tiny difference, this preference for one hand over the other, has shaped human history in ways you wouldn't believe. It's changed languages, influenced wars, gotten people accused of witchcraft, and reveals something fundamental about how your brain developed before you were even born. Welcome to Briefly Science. Today we're talking about left-handedness. Why roughly 10% of humans are left-handed, why that number has stayed bizarrely stable for at least 5,000 years, and why, despite centuries of persecution, left-handers refuse to disappear. And we'll explain why the English word sinister literally means left-handed. Yeah, that's not a coincidence. Let's start with a word, sinister. Today, sinister means evil, menacing, threatening, dark intentions, bad vibes. But the original Latin word sinister just meant left. That's it. The left side, the left hand. Not evil, not unlucky. Just left. So how did left become evil in our language? Because for most of human history, left-handed people were treated like something was wrong with them. In ancient Rome, omens appearing on the left side were considered unlucky, bad news from the gods. The word sinister started absorbing those negative associations. Left equals bad, right equals good. The Latin word for right was dexter, which gives us dexterous, skillful with your hands. Adroit, clever and skillful comes from the French word for right. Notice the pattern. Right-handed equals skilled, clever, correct. Left-handed, you get sinister, gauche, the French word for left, which in English means socially awkward, and in Old English, lift, which literally meant weak or worthless. Even the word ambidextrous, meaning you can use both hands equally, literally translates to right-handed on both sides. Not skilled with both hands, right-handed on both sides. The language itself is biased, and it gets worse. Throughout history, left-handed children were forced to use their right hands. In schools across Europe and America, teachers would tie kids' left hands behind their backs, hit them with rulers when they reached for a pencil with the wrong hand. The goal was to correct them, fix the flaw. This forced conversion caused real harm. Stuttering, dyslexia, learning disorders, emotional distress. You're literally fighting against your brain's wiring, and your brain doesn't like that. Some cultures believed left-handers were cursed, touched by the supernatural, in league with wickedness. So if being left-handed has been associated with evil for millennia, if it's been actively suppressed, if it causes no obvious survival advantage, why hasn't it just disappeared? Why are 10% of humans still left-handed? Let's talk about what handedness actually is. Your brain has two hemispheres, left and right, and they control opposite sides of your body. The left hemisphere controls your right hand. The right hemisphere controls your left hand. For right-handers, the left hemisphere is dominant for hand control. For left-handers, the right hemisphere is dominant. Makes sense, right? But here's where it gets weird. About 95% of right-handed people have language in their left hemisphere. You'd expect left-handers to be the opposite, language in the right hemisphere. But no, 70% of left-handers also have language in their left hemisphere. Only 30% have it reversed or spread across both hemispheres. Why? We don't fully know, but it suggests that handedness and language aren't as tightly linked as we thought. Recent brain imaging studies looked at over 31,000 people, 3,000 left-handers and 28,000 right-handers. They found 10 specific brain regions where left-handers and right-handers showed different asymmetry patterns. In all 10 regions, left-handers had relatively larger right hemisphere grey matter. Makes sense. That's the hemisphere controlling their dominant hand. These regions are involved in motor control, executive function, language processing, and vision. Left-handers also show stronger connectivity between the left and right language networks. Their brains communicate across hemispheres differently. And interestingly, left-handedness is associated with better divergent thinking, more creativity, different cognitive processing styles, so the brains are wired differently. But why? Is it genetic? Sort of. But it's complicated. Early researchers thought maybe one gene controlled handedness. Simple, clean, nope. We now know that up to 40 different genes contribute to handedness. Each has a small effect individually, but together they influence which hand becomes dominant. Some of these genes are involved in determining left-right asymmetry in the body from the very beginning of development. One gene that keeps popping up is NME7. Fascinatingly, this same gene affects the positions of your internal organs, like whether your heart is on the left or right side of your body. The same biological mechanisms that put your heart on the left might influence brain asymmetry and handedness. But genetics can't be the whole story, because even identical twins, who share 100% of their DNA, often have opposite hand preferences. If two kids have left-handed parents, they only have about a 25% chance of being left-handed themselves. If handedness were controlled by a single dominant gene, that number would be way higher. So what's going on? Most scientists now think handedness arises from a combination of genetics, random developmental variation in the womb, and possibly some environmental factors we don't fully understand yet. Your hand preference starts showing up before you're even born. Fetuses show thumb-sucking preferences, movement preferences. By the time you're a few months old, the pattern is already emerging. But here's the evolutionary puzzle. Left-handedness appears to have fitness costs. Left-handers are slightly overrepresented in certain neurodevelopmental conditions. They used to have lower birth weights. Some older studies suggested shorter life expectancy, though that turned out to be because older generations were forced to switch hands, making it look like fewer old people were left-handed. If left-handedness has costs and no obvious benefits, natural selection should eliminate it. But it hasn't. Not in 5,000 years. Not in 50,000 years. The percentage stays around 10%. Across all cultures, all time periods, incredibly stable. Why? Enter the fighting hypothesis. This is where things get really interesting. The fighting hypothesis suggests that left-handers persist because they have a combat advantage. Here's the logic. If you're right-handed, you train against right-handed opponents. Because 90% of people are right-handed, 90% of your opponents are right-handed. You get really good at fighting right-handers. But then you face a left-hander. Their stance is backwards. Their punches come from unexpected angles. You've barely ever trained against this. You're off balance. Meanwhile, the left-hander? They've been training against right-handers their whole life. That's 90% of their opponents too. They're prepared. This is called frequency-dependent selection. The rarer left-handers are, the more advantageous their difference becomes. If left-handedness became super common, say 50% of the population, the advantage would disappear. Everyone would be equally experienced fighting both types. But at 10%, left-handers are rare enough to be surprising, common enough to persist. This sounds like a neat theory. But is there evidence? Yes. Strong evidence. A 2019 study analyzed over 13,800 professional boxers and mixed martial arts fighters, the largest sample ever examined. Left-handed fighters won significantly more often than right-handed fighters. Taking a random left-handed fighter and comparing them to a random right-handed fighter, the left-hander would have more wins 53 to 54% of the time. That might sound small, but in evolutionary terms, that's huge. This advantage held for both men and women, both boxers and MMA fighters. Left-handers are also massively overrepresented in professional combat sports compared to the general population. In interactive sports, fencing, tennis, baseball, cricket, boxing, left-handers consistently show up at higher frequencies than 10%. Studies have even shown it's harder to predict what a left-handed athlete will do next. Their movements are less familiar, harder to read. But wait, there's a twist. One study looked at the Apo people in Papua, Indonesia, a traditional society with very high rates of violence and combat. According to the fighting hypothesis, they should have elevated rates of left-handedness. They didn't. The rate was normal, around 10%. So the fighting hypothesis might explain why left-handedness persists, but maybe not why it's always 10%. There might be additional factors we're missing. Some researchers proposed a modified fighting hypothesis. Maybe right-handers had their own advantage. When holding weapons, a right-hand grip exposes your less vulnerable right side toward an opponent. Your heart and major blood vessels are on the left. A left-handed weapon grip exposes your more vulnerable left side. So maybe the balance settled at 10% because that's the evolutionary sweet spot. Right-handers have a slight survival advantage in armed combat. Left-handers have a surprise advantage in hand-to-hand fighting. The two forces balance out. We're not certain. But the data from modern combat sports is pretty convincing. Left-handers win more fights. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but I'm not a gladiator. Who cares if my ancestors had a fighting advantage? Fair point. But here's why this matters. Left-handedness reveals something beautiful about human diversity. For thousands of years, left-handers were persecuted, called evil, forced to change, punished, and they refused to disappear. Not because left-handers are stubborn, though maybe they are, but because this trait is woven into the fundamental development of the human brain. Your handedness is determined by how the two halves of your brain specialize, by the asymmetrical twisting of cells in the embryo, by the flow of fluids during development, by microtubules and cilia and gene expression patterns we're only beginning to understand. It's not a flaw. It's not a mistake. It's a variation in one of the most complex structures in the known universe, the human brain. And that 10% difference? It's been stable for millennia because it's protected by frequency-dependent selection, because rarity is an advantage in certain contexts, because the same genes that make you left-handed might affect other aspects of brain function in ways we haven't fully mapped yet. Left-handers show different cognitive processing, better divergent thinking, different patterns of brain connectivity. The world is designed for right-handers: door handles, scissors, notebooks, computer mice, musical instruments, everything. But left-handers adapt. They've always adapted. And now, finally, in the 21st century, we're starting to understand that there was never anything sinister about the left hand. Just different wiring, different brain organization, different strengths. The language is changing too. We don't force kids to switch hands anymore. We make left-handed scissors, left-handed desks. We've learned that trying to fix left-handers just causes harm. Your brain knows what it's doing. It figured out which hemisphere should be dominant for motor control while you were still in the womb. Forcing it to change just creates conflict. So the next time you see someone reach for something with their left hand, remember, that person's brain is wired differently than yours. Their ancestors might have had a combat advantage. Their cognitive processing might be more flexible. And for thousands of years, people tried to make them conform, tried to correct them, called them evil, and they survived anyway. If you enjoyed learning about the neuroscience and evolution of left-handedness, subscribe to Briefly Science. We explore the hidden science behind everyday human traits you've never thought to question. What other seemingly simple human characteristics are you curious about? Let us know in the comments. And hey, if you're left-handed, you're not sinister. You're just statistically interesting.